The Athenians, initiating people into the Eleusinian rites, display to those being admitted to the highest mysteries the marvelous and most perfect secret for those initiated into the highest mystic truth, an ear of grain reaped in silence. The words of Hippolytus, a Greek-speaking Christian from the 3rd century A.D. Hello and welcome to the Western Traditions Podcast. My name is Rob Paxton, and this is the 27th episode of The Greek Sun, my second series of podcasts about the history of Western civilization. During the Peloponnesian War, when the very survival of Athens was on the line, the Athenian people recalled one of their most popular generals, Alcibiades, from the fighting on the front lines in order to bring him home for trial. The charge to be laid against him? Blasphemy. Alcibiades was suspected, among other things, of connection to religious vandalism in defacing numerous statues of the gods, but by far the heaviest charge to be presented in court was that he had mimicked and mocked the mystery rites of Eleusis while drinking with his friends in his private residence. Imagine this. Alcibiades, the man that the Athenian army adored, was brought home from a foreign expedition at a critical juncture because he may have, in the privacy of his home, may have mocked the secret rites of the Eleusinian mystery religion that was so widely followed by the Athenian populace. In this episode, we will try to learn more about the ancient and very secret mystery religions that had such a powerful grip on not just the Athenians, but on many Greeks, and indeed many people throughout the Mediterranean. Before we begin, though, let me remind you to visit the website, western-traditions.org, to find maps, pictures, source lists, episode transcripts, and recommended books to read. You can also purchase Western Traditions merchandise on the shopping page and/or contribute directly to the support of the podcast through the PayPal and Patreon options. Demeter was the Greek goddess of the harvest. This is kind of a loaded title, though. It is not as if she was some boring department manager reporting to Zeus about the quantity and quality of the Earth's production each year. No, in any pre-modern culture, the goddess of the harvest was often one of the most ancient deities, and shrouded in a number of overlapping identities and powers. Demeter was no different for the Greeks. There is the textbook idea of her that she was the child of the Titans Cronus and Rhea and sister to Zeus. She was responsible in whatever way gods are responsible for their domains. She was responsible for agricultural matters. But Demeter is much more than simply a divine bureaucrat overseeing grain production. Her cult, that is, the collection of rites and practices surrounding her worship, this cult goes far, far back, farther back than we can trace, really. We do not have to look hard at her name to see some resemblance to the root word for mother. The meter suffix, that M-E-T-E-R, end to her name, this could, and this is all speculation about Proto-Indo-European, a language which no one has ever seen or heard, but linguists have tried to reconstruct. This meter suffix to her name could be a form of the Proto-Indo-European word for mother. You can see how most Indo-European names for mother contain the M sound at the beginning, the T or a D sound in the middle, and the R sound somewhere close to the end. It's all separated by varying vowels. For instance, mater in Latin, or mutter in German, madre in Spanish, mother in English, and mitera in Greek. Is meter simply an ancient root for mother? It's the most likely explanation. As to what Demeter would be the mother of, this leads to a little more speculation. Is this a harvest goddess for the classical Greeks? Is she really just an updated version of some ancient earth mother? Some researchers have tried to connect the de prefix in Demeter to some possible ancient word for earth, like maybe de was a version of something starting with ge and hearkening back to Gaia, the earth mother. This Earth Mother, however she was named, would have been worshipped even before man became agricultural. She would have been the one that the hunter-gatherers praised and thanked for abundant game and for the rain that made the fruit grow big and fat on heavy-laden branches. So it's possible that Demeter, relegated in later days to an assistant position in Zeus's cabinet of gods, was once upon a time a much more exalted goddess. Maybe not even in a pantheon of gods. Maybe she was the goddess for a time. Maybe those ancient idols that we have found, some as old as 30 or 40,000 years, those morbidly obese figurines of abundantly fleshed women, maybe those are idols dedicated to Demeter or her predecessor, someone that Paleolithic men praised when the game ran plentifully through the valleys and surrendered to their arrows. And maybe Demeter was the one whom the women adored when berries and fruits and nuts seemed everywhere to hang plentifully from branches, and the roots came up easily from the soil. And maybe she was the one with whom they all pleaded when things were not so pleasant, when the rain didn't come, and the plants grew poorly and produced no fruit, and when the game was nowhere to be seen or too fast to be caught. Certain titles that the Greeks used for Demeter suggest a more recent, but still quite ancient connection to goddesses of preceding cultures. She's sometimes referred to as Despoina or as Potnia. The same titles are applied to her daughter Persephone in different contexts. Now, these are both terms that go far back, all the way to the Mycenaean period, and they're used to refer to certain goddesses. Think of them as the ancient Mycenaean, Cretan, or Minoan, or even Proto-Indo-European way of saying lady, just as Catholics refer to Mary as Our Lady of Guadalupe, or Our Lady of Fatima, or the Lady of Akita. So there is a great deal of speculation about Demeter's relationship to goddesses of ancient Crete, of the Minoan culture, and to goddesses even more ancient than that. For more information about the Minoan culture, check out the 21st episode of my first series, which you can find on my website at western-traditions.org. What is certain is that the worship of Demeter, especially as practiced at Eleusis and in Greece in general, the worship of Demeter was not simply a matter of checking off a box, of putting in some time at making sure that the goddess of the harvest was going to make the soil fruitful this year. This was not simply a perfunctory ritual performed to placate an potentially angry goddess. This was instead a religious act of profound and personal meaning, a communion with the very essence of life, a contemplation, a rumination, really, about being itself, to borrow a phrase from philosophy that we'll hear more about soon. Demeter, like a woman wearing a heavy, colorful shawl, was wrapped up in a variety of meanings, and those wrappings both defined her and made her true essence even more mysterious. She was not the naked Aphrodite, whose erotic significance was all too apparent. Demeter is an obscured goddess in some sense. She is shaded from the glaring eye. She rests in shadows, where she does her will. In the myths about Demeter, she has more than one lover. Sometimes it is Poseidon who forces himself on her. In another myth, she lays consensually with a mortal named Jason. She has offspring through all these unions, but her most famous union is with her brother deity Zeus, with whom she conceived her daughter Persephone. Now, the tale of Persephone's abduction and her mother's desperate search is told in an ancient Greek text known as the Homeric Hymn to Demeter. And as the story goes, one day Persephone was out in the fields under the shining sun when another child of the Titans, Hades, emerged from the subterranean world and captured her. He took her down to the underworld and lay with her there in a tale known in Greek mythology as the Rape of Persephone. In response, Demeter essentially holds the world hostage, and the grain does not grow and the trees produce no fruit until Zeus intervenes and negotiates a settlement. Persephone will enjoy part of the year above ground with her mother and part of the year in the underworld with her husband Hades, the god of the dead. Now, right away here, we should see that this is more than simply a way to explain the seasons. It's also a tale symbolic of death and resurrection, much like the Egyptian story of Osiris dying and being brought back to life by his grieving spouse Isis. And just as that story did for the Egyptians, this tale of death, as you might call it, and the resurrection of Persephone and the grieving of her mother become meaningful in a personal way for the Greeks. This is not simply a national public form of worship in which the gods were placated, praised, or thanked. It was not simply a group petition for a good harvest. The worship of Demeter and her daughter became an introspective, contemplative, inward journey in the heart of each worshiper, of each participant in the rite. But what was that rite, this mystery rite? This, the nuts and bolts of the rituals surrounding the worship of Demeter and her rescued daughter, this is the most mysterious element of the story, actually. Only after many centuries of putting together random fragments of remarks made by ancient Greeks and Romans, along with the odd piece of archaeological remains, only after centuries of working with even less than the bare bones, really, only in recent years have we been able to get some grasp of what was going on at Eleusis, and why the Athenians considered it all so sacred that even the idea that Alcibiades had mocked the rituals of that temple merited his dismissal from the army, and eventually a sentence of death passed on him when he refused to appear for trial. If you want to know something about a particular ritual, let's say the Catholic Mass, then your best option would probably be to go and attend a well-celebrated Mass at some nearby cathedral. Lacking that option, you would maybe be best off looking at the Roman Missal, a Bible-sized book that contains descriptions and instructions on all the rituals, as well as all the scriptural readings and the responses of the faithful and so on. But we cannot attend the Eleusinian mysteries. There are no practitioners of the right-left, there's no temples, no brotherhood of priests, and they printed no missal, left behind no written lasting guide as to the order of their rites. In contrast, we know, for example, that the Catholic worshiper makes the sign of the cross when he enters the church. He genuflects before the altar. He kneels in prayer. He stands to say the Lord's Prayer. He recites the Nicene Creed after hearing the gospel. He chants Lamb of God 3 times before he receives the Eucharist. But we don't really know much about what the Greeks did at Eleusis. We know a little about what they believed and a little about some of the instruments or the rituals performed there. Most of what we think we know really is just speculation, though. There were lesser and greater mysteries or ceremonies to be performed at different times of the year. Participants would walk in procession to Eleusis, making a sort of pilgrimage with ritualized stopping points. There does seem to have been 3 parts of the greater mystery rite, one of which would have been a reenactment of the story of the rape of Persephone and her retrieval from the underworld. There would have also been a display of certain items, such as grain, the bowls or baskets used to carry that grain, perhaps the blade used to cut the ear of the grain, and maybe other things as well. Finally, the priests apparently made some sort of spoken commentary about the events. Now, we know, or believe we know, based on a single sentence written by a Christian author several centuries later, which I quoted at the beginning of this episode, we know from this author that the high point of the entire ritual was the display of an ear of grain before the gathered congregation and the cutting of that ear of grain in silence. Some ceremonies apparently also involved a ritual bath, which has an obvious parallel in Christian baptism. Others scholars speculate that some sort of holy fire was also involved at some point during the rite as a symbol of purification, perhaps of leaving the old self behind. Because that was likely the real purpose, not just of the Eleusinian mysteries, but of all the mystery rites that we see around the ancient world, especially the Mediterranean basin at this point in history. The purification of the self through a kind of death, the redemption of your erring ways, and a rebirth as a better individual. Not better at athletics or at public speaking or at being a mother or a father or a warrior or a sailor, a wiser, better person in purely spiritual terms, a person more at peace with divinity, with mortality, with existence. At some point, and the timing of this is not really known at all, at some point the mystery rituals, not just the Eleusinian mysteries, but all the mystery rites of the ancient world, all these rites became more than just ways to guarantee a pleasant existence in the underworld, where you would hopefully no longer expect to be punished for your shortcomings. The ritual instead became about resurrection, at the very least a spiritual resurrection and immortality, living in glory with the gods. In at least one mystery rite, and this one we know very well, we know absolutely everything about its theology and the details of its worship rituals and so on. In that mystery religion, the rites became a way to secure a physical resurrection and a physical immortality as well. Not just life as a shade in the underworld, but as a physical being living for eternity in a glorified world. And this mystery religion, which promised physical immortality for the believer, this mystery religion about which we know so much, is still practiced today by more than 2 billion people. It's called Christianity. Often, when people think of the religious transition in the ancient Greek world from paganism to Christianity, they imagine a disruption, a significant break, going from standing around smoking altars, sacrificing animals to Zeus, and then suddenly turning to the clean, bloodless worship of Christ in cathedrals. But this viewpoint oversimplifies ancient Greek religious practices, and it also oversimplifies the early Christian church. The more you study ancient Greek religion from the classical era on, in particular, to the birth of Christ, and the more that you learn about the actual practices of Christians in the early centuries of the church, the more you realize that Christianity, under another name, was essentially already being practiced many centuries before the birth of Christ. And practice is a key word here. You see, today in the West, perhaps due more than anything to the Protestant Reformation, we tend to conflate religion with belief. In other words, what you believe in your head, what you perhaps confess in your creed, these things are what determine your religion today. But for the ancients, and for many people around the world still today, even many Christians, religion is more determined by what you do, by your practice, or praxis, as the Greeks would say. You are a Hindu because of what you do, not because of what you believe about Shiva or Vishnu, but rather due to where you pray and how you pray and when you pray and where you light candles and when you make offerings or what you eat or what you don't eat. You can see, studying history, that it was this way for Christians for a long time, too. You were a Catholic not simply because you believed that Jesus died on the cross and rose again, but because you ate fish on Fridays, you prayed the rosary, you went to Mass on Sunday, you confessed your sins, you walked in processions on high holy days, you put ashes on your forehead on Ash Wednesday, you fasted for Lent, and so on. These things made you the religion that you claim to belong to. This should go some way to explain why I think that the Greeks never really stopped practicing their religion, that Christianity, at least as practiced by the early Christians, and really maybe as still practiced by Eastern Orthodox Christians and other traditional liturgical Christians, is simply an extension of those same mystery religions that they were practicing 2,000 years ago when Christ appeared. After all, what drew early believers to the new cult that came out of Jerusalem in the 1st century AD, which initially only called itself the Way? And this is attested in the Christian scriptures several times in the book of Acts, beginning with chapter 9, that the name of this new rite, this new religious practice that we now call Christianity, was simply known as the Way. Was this a reference to a way of living, to the daily practices of its adherents? Anyway, what drew people to the Way, this new mystery religion, what was it? Now, the Jewish believers in Christ obviously had political and religious motivations of their own. They believed that Jesus of Nazareth fulfilled prophecies for their nation. The Gentile believers, though, who were entirely Greeks, at least culturally Greek, if not genetically Greek, at this juncture, they probably couldn't have cared less about Jewish prophecies. They probably saw this as simply an appealing mystery religion that just happened to be Jewish. After all, the way promised the same things that the Greek mystery religions offered and did it in the same way. Let's take a moment and revisit what we know about the mystery rites at Eleusis and compare it with Christianity. At Eleusis, there was an important story behind the rites about the child of a god suffering cruelty, descending into the underworld, and then returning to life, to a new life, to a transformed identity. So check off this box for Christianity too, right? Even today, at all traditional services of ancient Christianity, say the Catholic Mass or the Orthodox Divine Liturgy, and even some Protestant traditions such as the Lutherans or the Anglicans, the story is retold in every single worship service as part of a scripted rite in their Mass. Jesus was born the Son of God, he taught his doctrines during his earthly life, and after a cruel death on the cross, he descended into hell, returned from death with a glorified body that could walk through walls, appear and disappear, and levitate, and then he ascended into heaven. And then the gathered believers at these rites consumed the body and blood of their Lord. The religious rite at Eleusis offered the individual, the one who attended the rite, the opportunity to achieve a similar transformation, to undergo what happened to this child of God, to die to oneself and to reform and transform into someone else, a better version of oneself anyway. And the same went for Christianity. By following the commandments of the way and partaking of this new mystery rite about which Paul speaks in various epistles in the New Testament, Christians could achieve this self-transformation and then achieve immortality after their deaths. St. Paul, by the way, uses the Greek word mysterion, mystery, frequently throughout his epistles. The mystery rites at Eleusis also displayed relics important to the story told by the priests. The culmination of this display was the display and the cutting of an ear of grain as the congregation watched in silence. And the Christians in their rites also have these displays. There's a crucifix, and there might be pictures, statues, and finally they have the Eucharist. In the Catholic Mass, after all the readings have been done and the creeds and the prayers recited, the priest holds up a piece of unleavened bread, made, of course, from grain. He elevates it before the congregation, which remains silent at that juncture. And acting in persona Christi, as the Latin saying goes, he declares, "This is my body." Another example, in the story of the rape of Persephone, the grief of Demeter, her suffering, becomes part of her character. She becomes the personification of the long-suffering mother. And in Christianity, we have the same image. Mary is the suffering mother who watches her son be crucified. Catholics perform this ceremony known as the Stations of the Cross, a yearly ritual carried out before Easter in which they remember the journey of Christ from his condemnation to his suffering and death on the cross and his placement in the tomb. And at one of those stations, he meets his grieving, sorrowful mother. And in their religious practices and in their prayers, Catholics also remember the 7 sorrows of Mary. The rituals at Eleusis and in mystery rites practiced elsewhere were also accompanied by what scholars call commentary. But this is just another word for sermon or homily, so the priests of the Eleusinian rites were preaching sermons. And speaking of priests, the mystery religion of Eleusis had a hierarchy, both among the priesthood and the laity. There was the high priest or hierophant and the high priestess, and then the lesser priests that served them. Among the lay people, there were the initiates who were new to the rites, and then there were at least 2 levels of other believers. There were full members, and there were those known as the elevated, who were initiated into the highest secrets of the faith. And there was furthermore a group of secluded women associated with the temple. And there were varieties of jobs to do during the services for the other lay people, such as carrying the bowls or the torches and other items used in the ceremonies. And this is the exact same thing in more traditional Christian sects anyway, such as Catholicism and Orthodoxy. There's a hierarchy of clerics and a hierarchy among lay people too, including monks and nuns who are actually lay people under vows and who could easily just be interpreted as the Christian version of the elevated members of the Eleusinian religion. And the nuns are obviously just the modern version of the secluded women. And among the regular lay people, there are jobs at the liturgies, just like there were for the Greeks, serving at the altar, carrying various items in the procession of clerics in and out of each Mass. Someone has to carry the cross, someone else the holy books. There's readers and ushers and doorkeepers and so on. Even the names of the modern Christian ritual reflect this ancient Greek separation in the hierarchy of believers. The Catholic Mass is actually divided into two main parts, two separate masses, actually, although few lay people are aware of this today. The first half of the Mass, in which the readings are recited, the homily or the sermon is spoken, the creed is recited. This is officially called the Mass of the catechumens. Those are the learners still coming into church. In the early church, the initiated, those who had not been baptized yet, who were still learning and had not been introduced to the high mysteries of the religion, these people would be dismissed at this point. The elect who remained after this Mass would then participate in the Mass of the faithful, which is just the second half of the Mass today, during which time the body and the blood of their God would be consumed. And consider the implements of the rites in these ceremonies. At Eleusis, the grain was carried about in a special sacred basket or bowl known as a kiste, C-I-S-T-E. In the Catholic Mass, the hosts, the wafers made from wheat, are carried in a sacred vessel called a ciborium or ciborium, C-I-B-O-R-I-U-M. As I mentioned before, the Eleusinians also apparently burned a holy fire as part of their ceremonies, and to this day, Catholic priests burn a holy fire on the Easter Vigil, the dark of the Saturday night before Easter morning. The worshippers at Eleusis drank a special brew, a concoction made from barley beer. Christians, traditional Christians, drank wine at their ceremonies, wine which they believe is the blood of their God. But actually, there were other mystery religions at play in Greece during this same time period, the late 5th century BC, when Alcibiades was recalled from his role as general in the Peloponnesian War and ordered to come home for a trial of blasphemy. And at least one of these other mystery rites at this time required the drinking of wine rather than beer. And while these worship services did not exclude Demeter and her daughter, the focus was rather on a different deity, the god of wine, Dionysus. When we consider the other mystery rites prevalent in Greece, we begin to see even more similarities to Christianity. I want to consider now the Orphic rites, which originally stemmed from the story of Orpheus, who also descended into the underworld after suffering a personal tragedy. You may remember that the love of his life was killed by snakes, and then Orpheus, after trying to fetch her from the world below, from Hades, he had to return alone to the world above. Born out of this particular myth was another mystery religion. But first, I've been throwing around this term quite a bit already, mystery religion. Why do we call them mystery religions? In modern English, we use the term mystery to mean something unknown and simultaneously strange, perhaps incomprehensible. The meaning of the word has more nuance in Greek. The mystery religions centered around knowledge that was hidden, unknown, yes. So it was that in that way unknown in the sense of the definition, that it is there, but the mystery in these religions was something that was meant to be revealed to the initiated. Those who were already in the religion then possessed a secret knowledge, a collection of mysteries, which they revealed to those whom they chose to initiate into these mysteries. That is why it is called mystical knowledge, because you must spiritually ascend or transform in order to comprehend it. So mystery religions required initiation. And just so, many Christian traditions, especially the older branches of Christianity, Catholicism and Orthodoxy, these sects utilized long initiation processes. In Catholicism, it's known as the catechumenate, the year-long or more process in which a candidate is slowly brought into the church, learning its doctrines and usually completing the journey in a special ceremony at Easter. One could also only learn the mysteries of Eleusis by being initiated through a long process into the group of believers, the elevated ones. And this goes some way to explain why those who belonged to such a cult would be angry with someone who revealed the information publicly, such as Aeschylus was accused of doing. And this helps explain why Alcibiades was publicly charged, because not only had he allegedly discussed the rites openly, but also mocked them. And this explains the suspicion toward early Christians in Rome, who performed a secret ceremony about which they could explain nothing to the public. This was at a time when many mystery religions were breaking out in Roman society and replacing the more formal ancient worship of the Roman gods of the state religion. Now, the threats made against Aeschylus and Alcibiades during the 5th century BC, they involved the mystery rites of Eleusis, but there were other mystery religions around Greece during this time period. As I mentioned, one of the more popular sects in classical era Greece was the Orphic Mysteries. But contrary to the name of the rites, the Orphic Mysteries appear to have focused most of their rituals around the story of the god of wine, Dionysus. For a long time, scholars of ancient Greek history viewed Dionysus as a later addition to the Greek pantheon. For instance, as a child in school, I was taught that Dionysus had joined the 12 Olympians later and that you had to remove one of the other gods to make room for him, Hades or Hestia, perhaps. The standard scholarly explanation of this addition was that Dionysus was a deity from Thrace or some area adjacent to mainland Greece and was only reluctantly incorporated into the pantheon at a later age of Greek history. In more recent time, researchers have come to see that Dionysus was probably always a part of the Greek religious spectrum, having some sort of divine status even among the early Mycenaeans, and therefore being quite ancient and actually integral to the Greek pantheon of gods. But the story of Dionysus is difficult to tell because it has so many versions. The textbook version told to school children is simply that he was the god of wine and a son of Zeus. But there are a variety of stories about Dionysus which reveal that he was, for the Greeks, much more than simply a god of wine and merriment. In one widely told tale, Dionysus was a son of Zeus who was killed by Titans. In the tale, these Titans actually tear Dionysus into pieces and eat him. Recall for a moment the Egyptian story of Osiris also being cut into pieces before being put back together and resurrected. In response to the death of his son, Dionysus, Zeus throws one of his famous thunderbolts and turns the Titans to ashes. Now, later, Dionysus is brought back to life, and an important symbology is born here. Dionysus's material body here is perceived theologically by ancient Greeks to have come from the Titans, the earlier gods who are depicted as evil. And therefore the physical body of all people is deemed somehow tainted by this evil. But the spiritual resurrected form of Dionysus then comes from Zeus. So the human soul is perceived in a more positive light, a contrast to the earthly body because of all this. This will be a much more significant philosophical and theological point in our discussion of Christian Gnosticism during the 3rd series on the Roman Empire. But other myths associated with mystery religions instead describe Dionysus as a close family member with Demeter and Persephone, either as a husband or son to one of these female deities. Sometimes, in the telling, he is known by the name Iacchus, Iacchus, which perhaps goes some way to explaining why the Romans called him by the similarly spelled name Bacchus, Bacchus. Either way, Dionysus is wrapped into a sort of trinity with these two goddesses, Demeter and Persephone. And in these tales, Dionysus, or Iacchus, is a suffering soul, one who dies and is brought back to life by one means or another. And his earthly followers, the participants in the Orphic rites, commemorated his suffering and death in religious rituals. And in these rites, the initiated drank special wine, which is described as his blood, Dionysus's blood, in order to achieve communion with their god. Sound familiar? Now, I know that this episode is supposed to be about ancient Greek religion and the rites associated with Eleusis. You might find the interlacing of early Christianity to be incongruous with this proposition, but I hope that what I have described so far and what I continue to describe helps you to see that there never really was any kind of break in Greek religion, that many Westerners today are essentially still practicing an ancient Greek religion. The name of the god is different, and he has a Jewish heritage, but the promises and the practices of the religion are essentially the same. And I would also hope you understand now that ancient Greek religion was not simply a series of animal sacrifices, the heroes of the Iliad standing on a beach beside smoking hecatombs dedicated to Zeus or Poseidon and so on. And let there be no doubt, though, of course, such practices, animal sacrifices, even the occasional human sacrifice, were a significant part of the religious expression of the ancient Greeks, even in the classical era. Even as public worship of the Orphic and Eleusinian mysteries abounded, they still continued to worship the Olympians. But many Greeks also adhered to these other forms of spiritual expression, and mystery religion appears to have been more fundamental, more meaningful to them than we have been able to completely understand, even though thousands of years have passed since they were practiced. And as for the Jewishness of the final winner in the competition of mystery religions that was occurring in the Mediterranean 2,000 years ago, even the Jewishness of Jesus is not as alien to Greek culture as you might initially think. In later episodes of this podcast series, you will hear how the Greeks, under Alexander the Great, actually conquered Palestine and came into direct contact with Judaism in the 4th century BC. And how those Jews, when they rebelled against their Greek masters 2 centuries later, how those Jews reached out to the Spartans, of all people, for aid and assistance in their revolutionary struggle. In fact, the Jews who wrote the letter appealing for aid, and there's a copy of this letter in the book of Maccabees in the Bible, these Jews claimed ancient brotherhood with the Spartans. And really, we already know of numerous other connections between the mythologies and the peoples of all of the religions of the Mediterranean basin, Greek, Egyptian, Phoenician, Hebrew. The story of the flood, for instance, was everywhere, for example, among all cultures. Consider the offering of bread and wine in a religious ceremony as described in Genesis chapter 14, which is probably one of the oldest sections of the Bible, that is, a portion of the text originating in written form farther back in the past than most of the rest of the Bible. Clearly, these ideas, these practices, these ceremonies were widespread throughout the Mediterranean. Consider this similarity in story from both the Greek and the Hebrew mythos. Recall that Demeter brought Persephone, her daughter, back from imprisonment in the underworld, but Persephone was not allowed to entirely forsake that underworld. She could only spend part of each year in the world of daylight, according to the story, because while she was Hades' captive, she ate some of a pomegranate, a fruit from that underworld. Now, eating any food of the underworld had been forbidden to her, but she had not been able to resist, and so she consumed some of that fruit before departing Hades with her mother. So ultimately, she was cursed by this act of eating forbidden fruit and not allowed to entirely escape, but had to return for a portion of each year to reside with Hades. I don't think it's that difficult to compare this story of eating forbidden fruit and being punished for it to the Eden story in the 3rd chapter of the book of Genesis. In that story, not only are Adam and Eve removed from paradise for eating the forbidden fruit, but they are cursed to work the earth and to suffer those very climatic changes which occur in the wake of Persephone's sojourn in hell. You will come to see, I hope, that people have often, unfortunately, in studying the past, they've divided our ancestors into neat, clean classes, into groups of completely distinct people with no communication with one another and no cultural sharing, placed them in these separate boxes, essentially, to make them easier to understand, perhaps. We study the Greeks over in this box, and the Romans here in this box, and the Jews over there, and we study the Egyptians over here, and so on. But in reality, the past is all part of this same tapestry in which we live now, and the threads are all intertwined. And this ancient Greek religion that I've been telling you about, it's still around us. Inside every church that you pass anywhere in the West, the mystery rites, in some form, are still being practiced. The rites at Eleusis and elsewhere involved the ingestion of substances, food and drink. We have seen already how grain and barley beer were key elements of worship at Eleusis. The Orphic rites concentrated more on the consumption of wine. But the term used to describe the beverage generally remains the same throughout references to these celebrations. The drink is usually called Kykeon. Some people pronounce it Kykeon due to transliteration problems from Greek, but I will use Kykeon just for the purposes of this podcast. Anyway, the Kykeon was often mixed with other substances. It may very well, in fact, have been what Alcibiades and his friends were drinking when they allegedly mocked the rites of Eleusis. The term Kykeon is actually used in the lines of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Recall passages from the Iliad in which the Greek heroes prepare drinks and sprinkle barley and cheese into them. These are Kykeons. In the Odyssey, Kykeon is the word used to describe the potion that the witch Circe prepares in order to turn Odysseus' sailors into swine. In the mixture of barley and wine and water and herbs and such, she also mixes in evil drugs, according to Homer. Pharmaka is the Greek word used here for these drugs that Circe mixes into the Kykeon. From this word, we derive pharmacy in English. But the basic ingredients of the Kykeon, anyway, seem to have been barley and water, to which you could add cheese, herbs, wine, other substances, such as those pharmaka that Circe added to her potion. On this matter of pharmaka, we have learned a lot more in recent years with regard to how ancient people used drugs. Now, I know that drug use may sound like a modern phenomenon, but this couldn't be any farther from the truth, really. In the West, we have long tended to separate alcohol from quote-unquote drugs, probably to ease our minds when we crack open a beer with friends, but really almost everyone these days is using drugs of some kind, especially the prescription kind. But even if you just drink coffee or tea, you're ingesting a substance to alter your physiology somehow, to affect your mind, to give you energy, wakefulness, to dull your senses, or to heighten some experience. When Europeans discovered coffee and tea and tobacco in the last 4 or 5 centuries, the use of these substances swept the West no differently than cocaine did after it was discovered and developed. But coffee and tea and tobacco were bought, transported, marketed, and sold by major corporations, such as the East India Company, so they were not declared illegal. That digression aside, consider how long we've been using some of these drugs. Beer itself was invented some 10,000 years ago, possibly before that. And wherever scientists find remains of early agriculture, they always find evidence of beer brewing as well. In fact, there is a very plausible theory that we invented agriculture in order to brew beer, not to make bread, that bread was more bug than feature in this critical cultural development of the Stone Age. Anyway, it's also known now that the ancients were very aware of other mind-altering substances as well. Studies of still existing hunter-gatherer groups show us that even pre-agricultural humans will look for and or manufacture mind-altering substances to either alleviate their boredom or to heighten their natural experiences. And in the Middle Ages, such substances were certainly known already. There's no sign that they were newly discovered then. No, they had been around for some time in the ancient world. One such mind-altering substance, getting back to the subject now, is the fungal parasite ergot, which can grow on grains and cereals such as barley, wheat, or rye. If you are an American, you may already be aware of the theory that the Salem witch trials of 1692 may have been inadvertently caused by this very fungus growing on their cereal crops, in which, when consumed by humans, can lead to visions and experience not unlike those caused by LSD, a modern synthetic hallucinogenic, and not unlike the visions that the children had in that village of Salem back in 1692. Now, it's been speculated as well then that the growth of ergot, or possibly some other substance, may have been provoked and then infused into the barley beer that was used at Eleusis, into the Kykeon, in order to provoke visions or some other type of ecstatic experience. Perhaps this was the pharmaka that Circe put into her potion, causing the sailors of Odysseus' crew to believe that they were pigs. Among the other possible substances used in these potions and these kykeons, we must also consider mushrooms, which appear significantly associated with religious and or magic rituals in ancient Greek art, and also appear in both early and medieval Christian paintings, actually. I will include examples of this art on my website, western-traditions.org. Some mushrooms contain the substance psilocybin, which induces hallucinations in humans. Now, this possibility should not surprise us all that much. After all, we already know now that at Delphi, where it was believed that the gods spoke directly to petitioners through the mouth of the priestess, even if it was in the form of riddles and enigmas, we know that the visions of the priestesses at Delphi were likely inspired by one or more of a variety of substance-related causes, such as the inhalation, purposeful or not, of hydrocarbon fumes emitted from a chasm below the site. Other scholars will speculate that the Bible actually contains multiple references to such events, that the burning bush, for example, actually provoked Moses' visions in the book of Exodus. A number of plants in the Middle East contain substances similar to DMT, a recognized hallucinogen, and when they burn, you could easily inhale enough of the substance to alter your perceptions, to see God, so to speak. In the New Testament, in St. Paul's epistles, he often instructs and admonishes his followers about their Eucharistic ceremonies in which they remember the death of Jesus and consume his body and blood. In his epistle to the Galatians, chapter 5, verse 20, he warns his flock to avoid pharmaka, drugs. And if this sounds surprising to you, it's because the Greek word here in the text is usually translated into English as witchcraft. And this is not necessarily a bad translation. Pharmaka and witchcraft were closely associated in the ancient world. Witches used substances to alter the perceptions of their clientele. But it's also possible that the instructions of St. Paul here have a lot to do with toning down certain aspects of this new mystery religion, aspects which may have had more in common with other rites. Speculation abounds as to exactly what sorts of things that Paul was objecting to. It may have been, though, that he was telling Christians to stop using pharmaka in their Eucharist. The takeaway from all these digressions about mysticism and drug use should be that ancient Greek religion was not a cut and dry matter. It wasn't just one hecatomb of animal sacrifice after another. The Greek countryside was alive with temples and shrines and sacred groves. Every river was a canyon of spirits. There were wandering prophets channeling Tiresias, and there were witches brewing Kykeons with their pharmaka, and no doubt each of them styling themselves as another Calypso or Circe. The Olympians were worshipped formally and publicly. Bulls were sacrificed, but there were also a wide variety of spiritual practices among the Greeks, and among them were the mystery religions and their secret ceremonies and their holy meals. Now, to continue the theme that I've already established, it seems like this drink, this Kykeon, in whatever formulation, probably continued to be used in the rites of the mystery religion known as the Way, the original name for Christianity, which began to gain popularity in Greece in the 1st century AD. We've already made a strong connection between the forms of the pagan mystery rites and the Christian celebrations of their Eucharist, and we know how they both involve the display and the sharing of grain or bread, along with the storytelling and the preaching and the drinking of a beverage. By the time that Christ appeared, the Greeks were primarily drinking wine in these rites, and the focus of their worship had moved more toward Dionysus. So the story being told of these rites was more frequently that of Dionysus, of his death and his resurrection, which was reflected every year in the way that the vegetation died in the winter and was reborn every spring, and this tied Dionysus strongly then to the changing of the seasons and the fertility of the soil, somewhat supplanting Demeter and Persephone in these roles. In particular, grapevines, when fall and winter come around, the vines that we use to grow wine grapes, these vines die back considerably at the end of every year. They die back all the way to their roots, and then they are gloriously reborn in the spring, bursting dramatically into vibrant life. Now, Dionysus was the god of wine, and therefore the god of these vines, and his followers drank a Kykeon, made from wine and other substances, which was said to be his blood. Now, there was another deity in the Mediterranean who made similar claims, who said in the Gospel according to John, which was written in excellent Greek, by the way, who said that he was the true vine and who bade his followers to drink wine which he said was his blood. Jesus of Nazareth, in fact, said that his followers must eat his flesh and drink his blood in order to achieve immortality with him. It's not hard to see how the Greeks could have easily embraced Christianity as just one more option among the various mystery rites available to them, and thus, when looked at this way, Greek religion continues to be practiced today. Modern-day Christians receiving communion and professing to eat the flesh and drink the blood of their Savior are in many ways continuing a tradition much more ancient than they think, not simply 2,000 years old, but much older. Because the Greeks did not begin any of this. They inherited these ideas from prior indigenous cultures, probably from the Egyptians. I mean, when I think now of the communion hosts being distributed at Christian rites, I invariably think not only of Jesus at the Passover with his disciples or of his sacrifice at the cross, I also think of the pieces of Dionysus's body which the Titans consumed. I think of Egyptian mythology and the pieces of Osiris's body falling into the river, one morsel of which the crocodile Sobek consumed, and then became a god himself. In this episode, I have made frequent references to the Catholic Mass and drawn comparisons to ancient Greek mystery religions. I have done this because I am most familiar with the Catholic liturgy out of all the Christian rites, and it is also the Christian religion that is most representative of Western history, followed by more Westerners than any other sect. I think, based on what little I know about it, though, I think that if one were able to attend a Greek Orthodox divine liturgy, as they call their religious service, or any Eastern Orthodox liturgy, you might see even more evidence of a smooth transition from ancient pagan religious practices to Christian. The Orthodox liturgies are the oldest Christian rites in existence, and their medley of incense, bells, the offering of the bread and wine, which are presented as the body and blood of the Lord Jesus, their singing, their routine commemoration of the life, suffering, death, and resurrection of their God, all done in the language of the Iliad and the Odyssey. All this might just convince you, if I have not done so already. Hopefully, though, I've made clear that there never really was a violent break between religious traditions from quote-unquote paganism to Christianity, at least not in the Greek world, where Christianity got its start. I mean, the founding texts of Christianity are all in Greek. Rather, the Christians were one of several groups that practiced mystery rites in the Greek religious sphere, and their religion happened to be the one that endured, survived, overcame, and eventually came to dominate Western thought and spirituality for thousands of years. Even in Rome, for at least the first couple centuries after the birth of Christ, even in Rome, the religious language of the local Roman Christians was Greek, not Latin, because this Christianity was a Greek religion, a Greek mystery religion. I firmly believe that what eventually happened, that is, Christianity eclipsing the other mystery religions and becoming the sole mystery religion, all this was going to happen no matter what, in one way or the other. One of these religions would have overtaken the rest and come to eliminate the others. If the West were not Christian today, then it would be Dionysian or Orphic or Eleusinian or Persephonian or what have you. And therefore, this episode underlines a point that I have made since the very beginning of this Western Traditions project, that our history is not as foreign to us as many would have you believe. We know, for example, from genetic science that our ancient ancestors are actually still physically alive. They exist in the strands of DNA that they have passed down to us. Somewhere among us today, most likely, Socrates and Pericles and Leonidas live on in the form of haplogroups, chunks of genes that keep successfully reproducing from one generation to the next. If not those individuals, then others are still living on. There's a genetic study somewhere that declares that some really large portion of Western men today are all descendants of Charlemagne. And he lived 1,200 years ago. So that great king is still with us now, in a sense. We are in the same river in which his blood still flows. And I would hope also that this history of our Western traditions teaches you that even the practices, the habits, the beliefs, the very words of our ancestors, the words that they spoke, they're still among us today. They're still flowing through our words, our language, our thoughts, our actions. We are still thinking about the Roman Empire every day, according to the latest social media meme. We are all still really in the same tapestry with those ancient ancestors, just a little farther down the strand, at the edge, where the fibers are still tangling themselves together into a new design. So until the next episode, until the next intertwining of the threads of history, until then, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.